A new challenger enters the arena of space program games. Let's do a critical review of Spaceflight Simulator. So a few weeks ago, I got an email offering me a beta key to check out a new space sim game. Well, here it is. This is the very simply named Spaceflight Simulator, a PC Steam version of a game that was previously released on mobile and got something like 20 million downloads on the mobile platform. Well, a few things up front. This game is the work of one developer, a guy named Stefo Maj Morozna. He's from Slovenia, so please forgive me if I pronounce that wrong. Now, when watching the footage in this review, keep in mind that just one guy made this, which I think is really impressive. I came into this review knowing absolutely nothing about the game. I didn't read any of the documentation or watch the tutorial videos, so my experience was about as fresh as it could be. Now, at its core, Spaceflight Simulator is to Kerbal Space Program what Terraria is to Minecraft. This is a 2D rocket simulator, where you design rockets from scratch, fly the mission manually controlling the rocket, and basically do whatever you want after liftoff. This is an early access beta, or possibly a pre-beta build, kind of version of the PC game, so the career mode isn't enabled yet, and I don't know what that'll look like once it's done, but more thoughts on that later. Just remember that everything you're seeing here is very early beta footage and subject to change when the game is officially released later on. Now, Spaceflight Simulator is set in the real-life solar system. No little green men or anything with this one. And it currently includes Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, and some of the solar system moons. The atmospheres of Earth, Venus, and Mars are all modeled in physics. I didn't try and send a probe into Jupiter. First, a few thoughts about the interface when you're flying a rocket. Now, the UI for Spaceflight Simulator is very well done, considering this is an early access. A few things I like are how transfer windows are automatically calculated and displayed on the orbital trajectory when you zoom out and you're in the map view. If you right-click on a celestial body and you pick the Navigate option, it'll show you where your transfer burn should be on your current orbital path. That is a killer feature that I really wish I had in Kerbal Space Program instead of having to figure out manually or through trial and error. Also, after you launch, you get an orbital insertion trajectory indicator off on the bottom right, kind of to the right of your throttle and altitude display. This shows the angular trajectory that you should be going for in order to achieve, orbit most efficiently for, fuel and everything. This is another killer feature that makes the game significantly more accessible to folks who might not have a background in rocketry and might not understand, the mechanics behind, a gravity turn and all that. Now, another great feature is that the time warp in the map view can ratchet up pretty high, so once you get your orbital trajectory set for a transfer, you're not waiting 20 minutes for your probe to reach Mars or whatever. Now, something I don't like, when you're in the map view, it allows you to freely drag the camera all around the solar system, which is great, but there doesn't seem to be a keybind or an easy way to snap the focus back and recenter the camera and zoom back on your rocket. A minor pet peeve, and I suspect that, that can probably be added in the future. In the rocket assembly mode, the interface builds your rocket on a blueprint. This is pretty simple and intuitive. You just drag and drop the parts together to build a rocket. The UI for setting your stages up wasn't immediately obvious to operate, but the main convention in the design interface seems to be just single clicks on things instead of right clicks, double clicks, drags, or hovers. Once I remembered that this is being brought over from a mobile game, some of the interactions made a bit more sense. My only real gripe with the rocket assembly interface is that the grouping of the parts, other than fuel tanks, isn't as granular as I would like. Some of the fuel tanks and such are in the same parts group with like the space capsule and the probe core, and things like heat shields are in groups based on size, rather than having a parts group of just heat shields. A minor gripe, but sometimes I had to hunt for things in the rocket assembly. Overall, the selection of parts is pretty basic, but remembering that the game is in early beta, it's about what I would expect at this stage of development. The overall rocket design and assembly screen is pretty simplistic to figure out. I really don't think you'll have too much trouble with it. Now, the parts you get to build your rockets are basically pretty generic, and they don't really represent any real-world rockets or systems. That's okay. Just something to know, if you were hopeful that you'd be out building Apollo capsules or R7 rockets in the game. That kind of stuff might come later as part of the base game or in expansion packs or something, but right now in early beta, all of the parts are pretty simple and pretty generic. So let's talk about what you can actually do once you make yourself a rocket. As I had mentioned before, the game currently has the inner solar system modeled, along with Jupiter and a few of its moons. You get the parts to make a crewed spacecraft, rovers, probes, and basic landers. Atmospheres seem to be modeled accurately, and I was able to use a parachute to land a probe on the surface of Venus. Now, the atmospheric and surfic conditions of Venus aren't modeled, so my parachute didn't dissolve and my probe didn't melt, but that's okay, and if they model the surface conditions on the planets later, it might end up being something you can toggle as a difficulty setting. Now, in the current early access beta, there's no career mode, so you're just kind of left up to your own devices to explore in more of a sandbox mode. You can build rockets with enough delta V to get anywhere the game has modeled, and if you want to get really carried away, you can even make missions, that like return to Earth after a flyby of Jupiter or landing on Mars or something. Just be aware that it might get complicated, and the difficulty curve will ramp up significantly with stuff like that. Right now in the game, crew aren't modeled, and expendable supplies like air and electric power aren't present. Remember, very early beta. A set of solar panels is in the game, but they don't really seem to provide a function at the moment, and my space capsule, that presumably is supposed to have crew inside, made it all the way to Jupiter and orbit around Callisto without any kind of resupply. Again, the game is in early beta. So, what's my overall take on this? Well, in short, I think it has a lot of potential. The difficulty and learning curve are a lot easier than KSP, mostly due to it being represented in 2D. And I think the simplified mechanics might end up making this a lot more accessible to players who don't know as much about physics or, like, rocket construction. Now, there's a UI button for a career mode that's not yet implemented, so the potential exists for more than just the open-ended sandbox game. The game already has functionality coded in to detect events like entering orbit around a celestial body and stuff, so Steam achievements are certainly possible, and the future career mode might have clearly defined objectives like enter orbit around the moon or things like that. So it'll be interesting to see what direction the developer ends up going with those features. Now, the graphics are simplistic, but that's okay. Again, this is an early beta, and frankly, the basic, almost cartoony graphics might even appeal to a lot of players. Speaking of which, something I think this game has an enormous amount of potential for is educational use, or introducing younger players to the genre. The difficulty curve is a lot easier and more forgiving than similar games. The UI is simplistic, and getting a grasp on basic rocketry concepts and introductory level orbital mechanics is a lot easier in a 2D space. Also, failure isn't dramatic as it is in KSP, and I found that I was much less frustrated when things ran out of fuel or failed to reach orbit. No kidding, once this gets released, I'm seriously planning to suggest it for parents, who have kids that are interested in space topics. Overall, considering this game is the work of just one guy and is this good early in its beta, I think that Spaceflight Simulator has strong potential to be a pretty well-polished sim game once it gets released and, is out there officially. I'll be keeping an eye on this one, and I'll probably put another review up once it's finished. As always, thanks for watching.